Welcome back. Tonight, we're venturing into the heart of Africa, where the darkness holds secrets that have terrified locals for generations. These aren't just folklore or urban legends. These are documented incidents that have left survivors forever changed. Africa is a continent of breathtaking beauty, but when night falls, certain places transform into something else entirely. Places where the veil between our world and something far more sinister becomes dangerously thin. What you're about to hear comes from police reports, hospital records, and testimonies from those lucky enough to survive. So dim the lights, lock your doors, and remember, if you ever find yourself in Africa after dark, there are some places you should never, ever go alone. Let's begin with a story from South Africa that still sends chills down the spines of locals who remember what happened that night in 2018. In 2018, a group of urban explorers from Johannesburg decided to investigate the abandoned Kempton Park Hospital, a massive colonial-era medical facility that had been shuttered since 1996. Among them was Marcus, a 26-year-old photographer who specialized in capturing decay and abandonment. He'd explored dozens of abandoned buildings before, but he'd never gone alone at night until that October evening. Marcus had been hired by a European magazine to photograph African ruins after dark. The pay was excellent, almost 3 months' salary for one night's work. The catch? He had to go alone. The magazine wanted that isolated explorer aesthetic, no crew, no assistants, just him, his camera, and the darkness. The Kempton Park Hospital had a disturbing history even when operational. Built in 1902, it served as a tuberculosis sanatorium, psychiatric ward, and during the apartheid era, a place where difficult political prisoners would disappear for medical treatment. Local security guards refused to patrol the grounds after sunset. Even the homeless, desperate for shelter, wouldn't enter the building after dark. Marcus arrived at 9 p.m. The hospital loomed against the moonless sky, its broken windows like dead eyes. He'd done his research, or so he thought. What he didn't know was that just 3 months earlier, police had found the mutilated body of a vagrant in the hospital's basement. The case remained unsolved, the details kept from the public to avoid panic. As Marcus entered through a gap in the fence, his flashlight caught something that made him pause. Fresh flowers lay at the entrance, along with white candles, still warm, recently extinguished. Traditional healers in the area knew something Western urban explorers didn't. Certain places become portals after death, saturates their walls. The first hour went smoothly. Marcus captured stunning shots of peeling paint, rusted medical equipment, and corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. It was in the children's ward that things began to change. The temperature dropped so suddenly, his breath became visible. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a child giggling. Marcus froze. The giggling came again, closer this time, from a room marked Isolation Ward 3. Against every instinct, he approached. Through his camera lens, he saw small handprints on the dusty floor, fresh ones leading deeper into the ward. The prints were wet, dark. In his viewfinder, they looked like blood. That's when the screaming started. Not from one source, but from everywhere. The walls themselves seemed to shriek. Marcus ran, but the hospital had become a maze. Corridors he'd walked through minutes before now led to dead ends. Doors that had been open were now locked. His phone's GPS spun wildly, unable to lock onto his location. Security footage from a nearby business captured Marcus bursting from the hospital at 3:47 a.m., his clothes torn, deep scratches covering his arms and face. He was hospitalized for severe shock and dehydration. When police reviewed his camera, they found over 300 photos. The last 50 showed things that shouldn't exist: shadow figures in surgical gowns, faces in windows of rooms Marcus swore were empty, and in one terrifying image, a figure in a doctor's coat standing directly behind him in a mirror, though he'd been alone. Marcus never spoke publicly about what happened in those missing 5 hours, but the magazine never got their photos. Every image after midnight was corrupted, showing only static and darkness. Except for one, a child's face, pressed against glass, eyes milky white, mouth open in an eternal scream. The Kempton Park Hospital was demolished 6 months later. During the demolition, workers found 7 bodies in hidden rooms, patients who died during unauthorized medical experiments in the 1960s. Their records had been destroyed, their families never notified. They'd been waiting in that hospital for over 50 years, and Marcus had walked right into their domain. In Nigeria, there are places where the old gods still hold sway. The Osun-Osogbo Sacred Grove is one such place, a UNESCO World Heritage Site by day, but after dark even the priests won't enter without proper rituals. In 2016, an American anthropologist named Dr. Sarah Chen learned why these warnings exist. Dr. Chen was researching Yoruba religious practices for her doctorate. She'd spent months gaining the trust of local priests, documenting ceremonies, and learning the intricate rules that govern sacred spaces. But academic ambition has a way of overshadowing wisdom, and Sarah made a fatal error. She decided to document the grove's nocturnal spiritual activity without permission or protection. The Osun-Osogbo Grove isn't just a forest, it's a living shrine to Osun, the Yoruba goddess of fertility and rivers. The trees themselves are considered deities, and disturbing them after dark is said to invite their wrath. Local police records show that between 2010 and 2016, 17 people who entered the grove at night were found the next morning in various states of mental breakdown. None could explain what they'd experienced. Sarah entered the grove at 11 p.m. on a humid August night, equipped with night vision cameras, audio recorders, and EMF detectors. She'd mapped out a route during her daytime visits, planning to document any paranormal activity for her thesis. What she didn't understand was that the grove's protections weren't superstition, they were survival mechanisms developed over centuries. Her first indication something was wrong came when her equipment began malfunctioning. The night vision cameras showed movement between the trees, tall, impossibly thin figures that didn't match any local wildlife. Her audio recorder picked up whispers in Old Yoruba, words that hadn't been spoken in centuries, but it was the EMF detector that truly terrified her. It was reading levels that should have killed her instantly. At midnight, Sarah reached the inner shrine where the river meets the sacred trees. That's when she saw them, the Oro, the spirits of ancestors who guard the grove. They appeared as pillars of shadow, each one the height of 3 men, moving without touching the ground. Her camera captured one frame before dying. Dozens of these entities surrounding her, their faces, if they had faces, turned toward her. The possession began slowly. First, Sarah found herself speaking in tongues, not gibberish, but fluent Old Yoruba, though she'd never studied the ancient dialect. Then came the compulsions. She began stripping bark from sacred trees, an act of desecration that would horrify any priest. Her hands moved of their own accord, carving symbols she didn't recognize into her own flesh. A group of early morning worshippers found her at dawn, naked, covered in mud and blood, speaking prophecies in a voice that wasn't her own. She'd carved the names of 17 people into her skin, the 17 who died in the grove over the past 6 years. The priests performed an emergency cleansing ritual, but the damage was done. Dr. Chen spent 3 months in a psychiatric facility in Lagos. Her notes from that night, when finally translated, contained knowledge she couldn't possibly have possessed, details about ritual murders from the 18th century, names of priests who'd been dead for generations, and most disturbing predictions about deaths that would occur in the grove. 3 of those predictions came true before authorities permanently restricted night access. The footage from her cameras, when enhanced, showed something that still defies explanation. In the background of every shot, barely visible, were hundreds of figures watching her. Not spirits or shadows, but people, men, women, and children in traditional dress from various time periods. All of them were missing their eyes. Local priests later revealed that the grove serves as more than a shrine, it's a prison. Centuries ago, malevolent spirits were bound to the trees through powerful rituals. At night, when the barrier weakens, they seek new hosts. Sarah had walked into a supernatural detention center and nearly became a permanent resident. She returned to America changed. Colleagues reported she would fall into trances, speaking in Yoruba, writing symbols she claimed not to understand. Her academic career ended when she was found trying to create a replica of the grove's inner shrine in her apartment, using her own blood to consecrate it. The last anyone heard, she'd been institutionalized, still insisting the spirits had followed her home. Across southern Africa, crossroads hold special significance. They're places where worlds meet, where choices are made, and where, according to tradition, dark forces gather to make deals with the desperate. The intersection where the Nun Highway meets the Roan 101 outside Polokwane has earned a reputation that makes even hardened truck drivers plan their routes to avoid it after midnight. Between 2014 and 2019, South African police documented 37 deaths at this single intersection. Not accidents, murders. All victims were found with similar injuries, deep claw marks, signs of extreme terror, hair turned white, faces frozen in screams, and most disturbing, their hearts surgically removed while they were still alive. No tool marks were ever found. The pattern was always the same. Lone travelers would break down at the crossroads between midnight and 3 a.m. They'd call for help, but by the time assistance arrived, they were dead. Security cameras installed after the 10th death captured something that changed how authorities approached the case. The footage showed victims speaking to someone or something that didn't appear on camera. They would gesture, argue, then suddenly clutch their chests and collapse. In November 2019, a taxi driver named Joseph Molokane became the only known survivor. His testimony, given under oath to both police and traditional authorities, provides the only first-hand account of what happens at that crossroads after midnight. Joseph's taxi broke down at 12:47 a.m. He'd driven this route hundreds of times, but always ensured he passed this intersection before midnight. This time, a late passenger had delayed him. As he called his brother for help, he noticed a woman standing by the road. She was beautiful, wearing traditional ndebele dress, but something was wrong. She cast no shadow despite the bright streetlights. She approached his taxi, and Joseph noticed her feet didn't quite touch the ground. When she smiled, her teeth were filed to points, a practice abandoned generations ago. She spoke in perfect Sepedi, offering to help if he would just step out of the vehicle. Joseph, raised on his grandmother's warnings, refused to leave the taxi. That's when she showed her true nature. The woman's form began to shift and writhe. Her beautiful face melted away, revealing something ancient and hungry. She wasn't alone. Joseph counted at least 12 figures emerging from the darkness, all with the same pointed teeth, all floating inches above the ground. They surrounded his taxi, pressing their faces against the windows, leaving marks that looked burned into the glass. Joseph did the only thing he could remember from his grandmother's teachings. He turned his shirt inside out, placed a handful of salt on the dashboard, and began reciting protective prayers he'd learned as a child. The creatures recoiled, but didn't flee. Instead, they began calling him by names that weren't his, names of his ancestors, people who died at crossroads decades before. The assault lasted until 3:33 a.m. The creatures tried everything to get Joseph to leave his taxi. They took the forms of his deceased mother, his daughter who died in infancy, even police officers claiming to help. But Joseph held firm, recognizing each deception by their floating feet and shadowless forms. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, they vanished like smoke. When real police arrived at 6 a.m., they found Joseph's taxi surrounded by hundreds of footprints that ended abruptly, as if the walkers had simply vanished mid-step. The windows bore handprints that had melted into the glass. Analysis showed the prints weren't human, they had too many joints, and the palm lines formed symbols identified as pre-colonial binding curses. Traditional healers who investigated confirmed what Joseph's grandmother had always warned. Certain crossroads become hunting grounds for the Tokoloshi's more dangerous cousins, creatures that feed on human hearts to maintain their existence between worlds. They can't enter a vehicle without invitation, but they're master manipulators, using grief, fear, and desperation to lure victims outside. Following Joseph's survival, authorities took unprecedented action. Traditional priests performed cleansing rituals at the crossroads, and warning signs in 12 languages were posted. Night patrols were increased, but officers refused to stop at the intersection. They simply drive through, no matter what they might see standing by the road. The killings have decreased but haven't stopped entirely. Every few months, someone ignores the warnings or breaks down at the wrong time. They're always found the same way: hearts removed, faces twisted in terminal fear, surrounded by footprints that lead nowhere. The crossroads remain hungry, waiting for travelers who venture out alone after midnight. The wild coast of South Africa is named for its untamed beauty and treacherous waters. But locals know another reason for the name. This is where the boundary between our world and the realm of water spirits is thinnest. In 2017, a group of marine biologists studying tidal pools near Coffee Bay discovered why fishermen refuse to work certain beaches after dark. The team, led by Dr. Michael Thornton from the University of Cape Town, had chosen a remote stretch of coast known locally as Tokolosha Beach. Despite its beautiful appearance, pristine sand, dramatic cliffs, hidden caves, no fishing village had ever been established there. Jose elders warned that the beach was cursed, home to creatures that emerge from underwater caves at night to hunt. Dr. Thornton dismissed these warnings as superstition hindering scientific progress. His team of 4 graduate students set up camp on the beach, planning to study nocturnal marine life in the tidal pools. They had no idea they were camping in a feeding ground that had been active for over 300 years. The first night passed without incident, though the team noted an unusual absence of wildlife. No crabs, no nightbirds, even the usual insect noise was muted. They attributed this to their presence disturbing the ecosystem. On the second night, things changed dramatically. At 11:47 p.m., motion sensors placed around the tidal pools began triggering in sequence, suggesting something large moving from the ocean toward their camp. The thermal cameras showed heat signatures that didn't match any known marine life, bipedal figures roughly 4 feet tall, moving with impossible speed across the rocks. Graduate student Lisa Venter was the first to see them directly. She later testified that she'd stepped outside her tent to investigate strange scratching sounds. In the moonlight, she saw dozens of creatures emerging from a sea cave previously hidden by high tide. They resembled the traditional descriptions of tokoloshe, grotesquely proportioned humanoids with glowing eyes, but these were adapted for marine life, with webbed extremities and skin that seemed to shift between scales and flesh. The creatures moved with purpose, surrounding the camp in a coordinated pattern that suggested intelligence. They made no sound except for a clicking that the team's hydrophones identified as a form of echolocation. When Lisa screamed, alerting the others, the creature's behavior changed from observation to aggression. Dr. Thornton's journal, recovered after the incident, describes the next 3 hours in clinical detail that makes the horror more profound. The creatures tested the camp's defenses systematically. They disabled equipment with precision, cutting power cables and destroying communication devices. When the team barricaded themselves in the research station, the creatures began using tools, rocks shaped into primitive hammers, to break through reinforced windows. It was student Thomas Botha who remembered something from a cultural anthropology class. These creatures, according to Xhosa tradition, were bound by certain rules. They couldn't cross lines of ash from burned seaweed. In desperation, the team set fire to kelp they'd collected for samples, creating a protective circle around their shelter. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent. They shrieked, a sound the team described as grinding metal mixed with a drowning scream, and began performing what appeared to be a ritual. They brought offerings from the sea, fish arranged in geometric patterns, shells placed in specific configurations, and most disturbing, human bones that forensics would later identify as being between 50 and 300 years old. As dawn approached, the creatures retreated to their cave, but not before leaving a warning. Using shells and kelp, they created a perfect representation of the team's camp on the beach, then systematically destroyed it. The message was clear: leave or suffer the same fate. The team evacuated that morning, but their recordings revolutionized marine biology. Analysis of the creature's clicking revealed a language with over 200 distinct words. The movement patterns suggested a social structure more complex than most primate groups. And most unsettling, DNA analysis of saliva left on damaged equipment showed markers that were partially human, divergent from our species approximately 100 years ago. The South African government classified most of the team's findings, but leaked documents suggest these creatures aren't unique to Coffee Bay. Similar beings have been reported along the entire southeastern African coast, always in areas with underwater cave systems, always in places locals have marked as forbidden. Dr. Thornton never returned to marine biology. In his final interview before retiring, he made a chilling observation. We assume we're the only intelligent species on Earth. But what if we're not? What if we share this planet with beings that chose the ocean while we chose the land? And what if they remember when we were prey? The beach remained deserted. Local tour operators know to keep visitors away after dark. Sometimes, on still nights, you can hear the clicking sounds carrying across the water. The creatures are still there, still watching, still waiting for those foolish enough to camp on their hunting grounds after the sun sets. These stories serve as warnings etched in tragedy and terror. Africa's nights belong to forces we've forgotten how to fear, entities that view our modern skepticism as an invitation. Whether you're a traveler, researcher, or thrill seeker, remember, when darkness falls across Africa, some places must remain undisturbed. The old protections exist for a reason, and breaking them carries a price measured in more than just fear. Stay safe, stay in groups, and whatever you do, never go to these places alone at night.